Now, looking ahead at the next 40 years in human rights begs the question, how old are human rights? Was the Magna Carta in 1215 a human rights charter? There can be no doubt that the Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen of 1789 was. Yet when it comes to international human rights, a system that today consists of several dozens of conventions, declarations and monitoring bodies, its birth is generally situated at 10 December 1948, when the General Assembly of the United Nations voted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So this means that international human rights will celebrate their 65th birthday at the end of this year. Retirement age, that would be very inappropriate if one considers the huge challenges that the realization of human rights still present today. Instead, I submit that international human rights are quite young. With only 65 years of experience, looking ahead at the next 40 years is a very long time. When I was a law student, the idea that a world court would prosecute and judge war criminals was never taken seriously. Despite the Nuremberg experience, this was considered a utopia. Yet in 1993, only 1 year after my graduation, the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia was established, followed by the Rwanda Tribunal in 1994 and the Permanent International Criminal Court in 2002. My teachers had not seen that coming. I also remember how in the year 2000 some of my gay friends celebrated their union, with several of the invitees frustrated that our friends could not have a proper wedding and that they were not likely soon to have that opportunity in a country like Belgium. Yet 3 years later, 2003, the first gay marriage took place in Belgium. My friends and I had not seen that coming. And I clearly remember how human rights arguments used to trump other arguments in this part of the world. Then came 9/11 and the war on terror, and this told Western human rights activists that the story of human rights is not necessarily one of ever-increasing protection. They can also go downhill fast. A nation that considers itself the world's greatest human rights defender can introduce torture and detention without trial and be proud of it too. No one had seen that coming. So judging from the 2 decades of human rights that I witnessed, anything as well as its opposite can happen during the next 4 decades that I also hope to witness. The reflections that follow will therefore be highly speculative, yet I had a lot of fun speculating, and I want to thank the organizers for challenging me to do this. In the allotted 15 minutes, or what's left of it, I chose to reflect on the human in human rights. But you will see that the question whose human rights is intrinsically related to the question which human rights. So the story of human rights can be read as a story of increasing inclusion. The Magna Carta is hailed as a charter of liberties, but these were liberties of noblemen, feudal barons. The declaration of the 18th century French and American revolutionaries included non-noble citoyens. Yet, despite the equal rights rhetoric in those texts, the enjoyment of the rights of the French Declaration was limited to men, and political rights were limited to male property owners. The American Bill of Rights even upheld slavery. It required the rise of socialism to extinguish class discrimination in human rights. Today, there can be no doubt that human rights are intended to be enjoyed by each and every human being alive on this planet. This principle of universality, all human rights for all, it is one of the central dogmas of human rights discourse. It is, of course, a normative principle, as in practice we're all aware that not all human beings do enjoy all human rights, whether in law or in practice. Now, after the scope of human rights was extended formally to all humans, the story of inclusion has continued at a different level. When the awareness grew that the abstract human being on which human rights were modeled inevitably reflected patterns of dominance among humans. As a result, the human in human rights was predominantly white, male, adult, Western, heterosexual, affluent, and without disabilities. women were the first non-dominant group to claim a correction. This resulted in a specific treaty on women's human rights, focused on women's experiences of injustice and obliging states to specific action in these fields, and it also led to redefinition and reconceptualization. For example, finally including rape under torture, or recognizing domestic violence as a human rights theme. These are developments of the 90s of the 20th century, so that is quite recent. Now, similar inclusion claims were made and upheld by other groups, in particular children, people with disabilities, minorities, and indigenous peoples. This movement is unfinished, so it is likely to continue in the next decades. One group that is likely to become the subject of specific attention in the form of a separate declaration or treaty are older people. The United Nations has started work on this issue already. It is a group that is vulnerable for different reasons and to different kinds of violation. One reason is dependence of many elderly people on others, resulting in risks of physical abuse, poverty-related violations, as well as challenges to autonomy rights. Now, elderly people, in a way like children, for whom we have children's rights, it's not really a separate category, it's rather a stage of life. We've all been a child, we all intend to become older people one day. And in my opinion, that simple fact will actually make it fairly easy to gather sufficient support for normative development in this area. It's about us, not about them. So for the same reason, a much more difficult issue will be the advance of LGBT rights, or the rights of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. Enormous progress has been made in this field in the past decade or so, yet there is also strong resistance, inspired by various traditional voices, amongst others in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as religious voices, Christian, Muslim religious traditions. In the United Nations, the lobby machine of the Holy See joins forces with countries like Iran to block advance in this sphere. Yet, in my opinion, fast progress will continue to be made, and it will follow the same pattern that was followed until now. First, halting prosecution on grounds of sexual orientation, then guaranteeing non-discrimination in fields such as employment and housing, and finally full recognition through marriage or civil partnership and adoption rights. Now, in addition to the inclusion of all categories of human being, there's also the matter of dealing with all manifestations or configurations of human beings. Traditionally, the human claiming rights is an individual, directly confronted with violations or risks of violations. Yet this is not the only existing configuration, let alone the only possible one. Human rights can also be exercised by a collectivity. Corporations enjoy human rights, such as freedom of expression or the right to a fair trial. Group rights have been granted to indigenous peoples, yet they remain highly contested for other types of minorities. In many situations, collective rights better grasp the reality of what human rights are for than individual rights can. And this is due, amongst others, to the collective nature of emancipation movements that build on common identities. Think of language rights in Flanders. The use of Dutch in Flanders is sometimes a legal obligation restricting individual rights. For example, the right to teach English at Flemish universities. Now, this is in fact the expression of a collective right of the Flemish people to preserve their language. Yet this collective right is not expressed as such in the law. A very different example is that of gender quota. They are sometimes problematic as rights of individual women, trumping rights of individual men. When we talk about quota as a collective right of women as a group that carries a history of structural discrimination, the discourse comes much closer to reality. My prediction is that collective rights will play a more important role in future human rights development for the reasons I mentioned, but also because they offer a correction to a discourse that by many in non-Western societies is perceived as overly individualist. And we should not imagine the West dominating the world forever. Now, another innovative approach to human rights is that of the rights of future generations. Human rights of people who are not yet born, but of whom we know for certain that they will exist one day. That concept has become quite popular, especially in an environmental context where it emphasizes sustainability. Today's rulers tend to focus on today's problems. And democracy does not necessarily stimulate long-term planning with its regular election cycles. Yet, if we are aware that some of our actions today severely compromise the quality of life of generations to come because of the exhaustion of important goods, because of irreparable damage to important goods, should that not create an obligation to refrain from such action? The language of future generation has made its way into state constitutions, amongst others the constitutions of Germany and Kenya. And in 1997, UNESCO adopted the Declaration on the Responsibilities of the Present Generation towards the Future Generation. Yet none of these texts stipulates those future generations as rights holders in today's world. As the future generations are by definition not among us, the question arises moreover as to how they would claim the rights they might be granted. This would inevitably involve the creation of a body in charge of defending these rights, a council or an ombudsperson of the future generations. Now, I believe that some form of legal recognition of responsibilities to the future generations will be inevitable in the future. Yet whether the language of rights will be the vehicle remains to be seen. And what about the rights of our virtual self? A game developer, Ralph Koster, posted a declaration of the rights of avatars online in 2000, a fascinating document. Read the start of it. The document holds the following truths to be self-evident: that avatars are the manifestation of actual people in an online medium, and that their utterances, actions, thoughts and emotions should be considered to be as valid as those of people in any other forum. This is an interesting text. We read classical rights, free speech, equality, etc., but also specific provisions, such as the right of every individual in the virtual community to contribute to the code of conduct applicable in that virtual community. Virtual human rights are by no means a joke, or shouldn't be. If there was ever a place for universal rules, it must be in the universal space, that is, the internet. Life on the web is increasingly central to individual well-being. At the same time, threats to human rights abound in this space. Of course, the rights of avatars is only one aspect of the broader topic of human rights on the web, a topic that we can expect to become increasingly important. And what happens when all human beings in all their manifestations are fully included in human rights? Does this mean the quest for inclusion has ended, or are there more new subjects that can claim human rights in the future? In popular television series, it's not uncommon to see humanoids strive for the same rights as humans. I am thinking of the HBO series True Blood, in which vampires campaign for a vampire rights amendment to the US Constitution, of the Danish series Real Humans, in which Hubots, robots resembling human beings, try to fight discrimination through the court system. By the way, they look very much like the robot you showed on your slide, very much. Now, this may seem far-fetched, rights for Hubots or robots when we think about the next 40 years, but let me read you a scholarly quote. Supposing that robots, and perhaps artificial intelligence as embedded in intelligence carriers, will indeed become more autonomous in future, and that they will perform important, possibly vital functions in society, will they reach a point where it becomes useful or necessary to grant them fundamental rights? And then they make a parallel with cyborgs, so enhanced human beings with technology built in or connected to the persons. They are, of course, human beings. They have human rights. Now suppose that robots and artificially intelligent systems perform similar functions as cyborgs, and that they look the same because they become androids. Should they then not have the same catalogue of rights? Science fiction or not, only time will tell. But hearing some of the other presentations, these questions are closer to us than we may think. A rather different category of candidates for not quite human rights are animals. Animal rights activists argue that the basis for the recognition of rights should be in the capacity of suffering, and that animals suffer in a similar way as humans do, or that animals are part of the same moral community as humans, and that their exploitations by humans is to be rejected as speciesism, a label on a par with racism and sexism. Now, animals do enjoy increasing protection by the law against abuse and unacceptable living conditions, and they have made their appearance in a number of constitutions. Switzerland recognized the inherent worth of animals in its constitution in 1992, and in 2002 Germany wrote in its constitution a state obligation to protect animals. And the Council of Europe has a 1987 convention on the protection of pet animals. Not clear why they discriminate with other animals. Now, this was ratified by 22 states, including Belgium. Yet, none of these texts uses rights language comparable to human rights. A logic of protection is still very far removed from a logic of rights. So I doubt that in the next 40 years we will start treating animals as fundamental rights holders, a development that would obviously have widespread implications for the consumption of meat and other animal products. Now, while animal rights still rely on similarities with humans, we move into different territory when discussions are held about fundamental rights for nature. It may surprise you to hear that these rights have actually advanced further in legal terms, and hence it is fair to expect more developments along this line in the next 40 years. We see this movement in particular in Latin America, where environmental concerns are moved forward by movements of indigenous peoples. So the 2008 Constitution of Ecuador has a chapter 7 entitled Rights of Nature, which starts as follows: nature, or Pachamama, where life is reproduced and occurs, has the right to integral respect for its existence and for the maintenance and regeneration of its life cycles, structure, functions, and evolutionary processes. And Bolivia adopted in 2010 a law on the rights of Mother Earth, proclaiming 7 rights: the right to life, to the diversity of life, to water, to clean air, to equilibrium, to restoration, and to live free from contamination. Moreover, the Bolivians envisaged a special type of ombudsman institution to further the protection of nature's rights. In Europe, a related discussion is the campaign for the eradication of ecocide, a neologism building on the concept of genocide. It's about the widespread destruction of nature. Activists want an ecocide directive in the EU and want ecocide to be recognized as an international crime in the statute of the International Criminal Court. Now, with environmental and climate challenges ever higher on the agenda, we can expect, or indeed hope, for more international law efforts in this field. Whether these will take the form of rights language, however, remains to be seen. Now, these brief reflections have meandered from the quite likely to the rather far-fetched and back, yet if 65 years of international human rights have taught us anything, it is that what's likely today may be out of reach tomorrow, and vice versa. Human rights are above all made by humans. So my conclusion today is an invitation to all humans in the room to contribute to building the future of human rights.